The readout was wrong. Kale Voss stood at the edge of the observation platform, 40 stories above the ground floor of the Meridian complex, and stared at the numbers scrolling across his forearm display. Like a man watching a flood approach from the far side of a valley, he had exactly 3 seconds to decide whether to believe his own model or the sensor array that had never once been miscalibrated in 6 years. The numbers kept scrolling. He believed his model. "Shut down tertiary grid," he said. "Dr. Voss, tertiary grid is load-bearing for the entire. Shut it down, Hara. Now." The hum that had lived in the bones of this building for as long as anyone could remember died with a sound like a held breath releasing. In the silence that followed, every light on the Meridian's upper deck flickered once, went amber, and held. 47 research teams paused. 612 people looked up at the amber lights and felt the particular species of unease that comes from a building that has suddenly started thinking. 12 seconds later, the Eastern Sensor Cluster reported a pressure anomaly in the sub-basement coolant lines. Left uncorrected, thermal runaway would have reached the primary reactors in under 4 minutes. The amber lights went green. The hum returned. Kale exhaled through his nose and pulled up the next set of projections. He was 29 years old, and he had not been wrong about anything in 3 years. This was not arrogance. He had tested it carefully, tracking every prediction he'd made against outcomes, logging the deviations, hunting for the places his models failed. The places kept getting smaller. His field, predictive systems architecture, which a dry name for the science of anticipating what the universe intended to do before it did it, had reached a point of such refinement that the margin of error in his best models sat below 0.1%. This was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. It was also beginning to terrify the people around him. "Board wants to speak with you," said Hara, falling into step beside him as he walked the gantry toward the elevator bank. She was his senior coordinator, small and precise, with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned very early that Kale moved fast and rewarded people who moved faster. They've been asking about the Phase 4 forecasts. "Tell them what I told them last month. The forecasts haven't changed. They've changed their minds about whether they like the forecasts. That's not a forecast problem. That's a feelings problem." Dr. Voss, Kale. She stepped in front of him, a thing she almost never did. Her wrench expression carried the particular weight of someone delivering news they had been rehearsing. "They're also asking about the incident at Tesson Station. The one you predicted 17 days in advance." He waited. "They're wondering," she said carefully, "if perhaps some information should be shared with the Bureau of Integrated Systems. In the interests of making sure I end up in a government basement running weather models for the rest of my life." He stepped around her and pressed the elevator call button. No, the elevator opened. He got in. What he didn't tell Hara, what he had never told anyone, was that the forecasts had changed, not in their conclusions, in their shape. 18 months ago, the models had started showing a new variable, something he couldn't name, couldn't quantify, couldn't fit into any matrix he'd built. It showed up in the data the way a stone shows up in still water. Not the stone itself, but the ripples, the perturbation, the way everything else bent around its presence. Something was watching the Meridian complex. Something that did not operate by any logic he recognized. They called themselves the Vreth, though the name meant nothing in any human language, and had not been translated so much as transliterated. Sounds that approximated sounds, the way you might write down the noise a dying engine makes, and call it a word. They had been here for 11 years. Or they had been here for 1100. The Vreth did not track time the way humans did, because the Vreth did not have a consistent relationship with cause and effect. And time, as any physicist will tell you, is mostly a story about cause and effect. What was known? They were old, they were large. They existed in a state of perpetual biological flux, their forms shifting across hours and days in ways that seemed random but followed deep statistical patterns. Mutation as strategy, chaos as immune response, disorder as the fundamental currency of their civilization. What looked like entropy from the outside was, from the inside, a kind of breathing. They had arrived in the outer system, without warning, without announcement, without any of the diplomatic niceties that the human species had spent 2 centuries imagining first contact would involve. They had simply appeared, the way a weather system appears, coalescing from conditions that had always been present, but had not yet found their moment. Their ships, if ships was the right word for structures that rebuilt themselves continuously, that had no fixed geometry, that sometimes resembled vast biological structures and sometimes resembled nothing so much as a storm-given mass, had settled into a slow orbit around the fourth planet and begun doing something that no human instrument could precisely characterize. Later, the best available description would be waiting. They were waiting for something to tip. The Vreth Empire. The Congregate, they called it. The name meaning something closer to the gathering of chances, had flourished for longer than human civilization had existed by drawing power from disorder. Not metaphorically. Their biology required it. The perpetual mutation that defined their form was not just cosmetic, it was metabolic. They processed chaos the way humans process oxygen, extracting from the random and the unpredictable the energy that sustained their cells, their ships, their culture, their continuity. A Vreth deprived of disorder would weaken and eventually die. This had never been a problem. The universe was full of disorder. The Vreth were old enough and perceptive enough to notice over the past several decades of slow approach to this small blue world that something here was different. The disorder was decreasing. Not everywhere, not catastrophically, but in specific nodes, cities, research facilities, industrial systems. The statistical noise that should have been present was being systematically reduced. The future was becoming more legible, and a legible future for the Vreth was a lean future. The High Caster, which was what the Meridian Complex's translation software had eventually decided to call the Vreth's senior decision-making entity, had reviewed its options at length. The options were broadly two: destroy the sources of predictive order before they became critical, or find the being most responsible for the reduction and offer it something it wanted. The High Caster had been watching Kale Voss for 8 months. The High Caster had decided to talk. They came in the night, which surprised him less than the method of entry. Not through any door or window or structural breach, but through the electrical systems themselves, which he would later understand was a form of politeness. A knock, in Vreth terms. A deliberate disruption of the very system they'd spent weeks observing. Small enough not to trigger alarms, large enough to tell him, "We know where you live. And we came this way so you would know that we knocked." He was at his desk. The screen in front of him went dark. Then it showed something that wasn't data. A spatial representation, three-dimensional, of something large and incomprehensibly complex, rotating slowly in space. Then text, in his own language, which meant they'd been listening long enough to learn it. "We wish to speak with the one who reduces chance." He sat very still. Shh. His first thought, which he would be embarrassed by later, was to check whether his model had predicted this. It had not. The new variable, the stone in still water. He had known something was coming. He had not known what. He typed, "I'm listening." The response took 11 seconds, which meant either translation delay or deliberate pacing. He suspected the latter. They struck him, already, as beings who understood the weight of timing. "You make the future visible. This harms us. We propose an arrangement." Kind of arrangement. He said it aloud before he remembered they were communicating by screen. But the screen responded. "So they'd been listening too. Your predictive work will stop. In return, we offer you anything within our power to give." He leaned back. His chair creaked. The same creak it had made for 3 years, which he had predicted down to the frequency by tracking the wear pattern on the left rear caster. Familiar sound. "His world, anything," he said. "Yes, show me what you look like." A pause. Then the screen displayed a visual feed. External cameras from the eastern tower, aimed at nothing, aimed at the sky, and then in the sky, something that had not been there before. Vast and shifting and beautiful in the way that catastrophic things are sometimes beautiful. All edges and no edges, all form and no form, like watching a living equation try to decide what it wanted to equal. The Vreth. Present above his building. Present for, he suddenly understood, much longer than tonight. "I'm not going to stop," he said, "but I'll hear your offer anyway." The High Caster sent an emissary to the building the next morning. This was the thing that looked most like negotiation, and was, in Vreth terms, more like the moment a tide commits to a direction. The emissary was a smaller Vreth. Smaller being relative, it still filled an entire conference room and reorganized itself 3 times during the conversation. And it carried with it a piece of Vreth cultural technology that the Pawn's translation software rendered as a future gift. The Vreth could offer, it explained, selective restoration of chaos, strategic disorder applied to specific targets. They could make things go wrong for your enemies. They could make certainty collapse. They could ensure that any outcome became slightly more probable, not through interference, but through the subtle seeding of noise into the calculations of whoever stood against you. Kale listened to all of this. His recorder ran. Pura sat in the corner, trying to look professionally detached and succeeding imperfectly. Describing a weapon, he said. The congregate does not use the concept of weapons. Describe a gift of uncertainty to those of your choosing, and what do you want in return? We wish you to stop. Stop predicting. To stop reducing the field, yes. Your models extend further than you know. The ripple of your certainty reaches systems you have never observed. The future is becoming harder to breathe. He thought about this for a long time. The emissary waited, reforming one of its peripheral structures absently. The Vreth equivalent, he would later decide, of drumming fingers on a table. I want to understand something, he said finally. You've been declining for how long? The emissary was still for 3 full seconds, which was, for a creature in perpetual motion, the equivalent of a flinch. 11 of your years, accelerating. And the rate of acceleration? That is not information for this stage of negotiation. But the pause before the answer had told him what he needed. He had built his career on reading the shape of pauses. I'll need time to consider your offer, he said. He had already decided, he just needed them not to know that yet. He worked for 14 days straight. Hara brought him food and took away the empty containers and did not ask questions, because Hara was very good at reading rooms. And this room said, something large is happening, and if you interrupt it, you will regret it. She watched him fill wall after wall with notation, watched him tear down and rebuild his primary model 3 times, watched him stop sleeping in any recognizable pattern and start operating in the focused hypnagogic state that she had only ever seen in him twice before. Once before the Tessan station prediction, and once on the night he'd redesigned the Meridian's core thermal architecture at the age of 24, standing barefoot in a server room at 3 in the morning, writing on the walls with a marker because he'd run out of paper. He was looking for something specific. The point at which the Vreth's own model broke down. They fed on chaos. They processed disorder like metabolism, which meant they had spent their entire evolutionary history optimizing for a universe that contained abundant disorder, and had never, in all that history, been required to adapt to a universe that didn't. The certainty he was creating wasn't just uncomfortable for them. It was outside the range of anything their biology had been built to handle. They were like a species of deep-sea creature suddenly confronted with sunlight. Not just unfamiliar, categorically new. He found what he was looking for on the morning of the 15th day. The emissary had been waiting in the building's lower conference room, reorganizing itself with increasing agitation, for 6 days. I have a counteroffer, Kale said. He placed a data card on the table between them. The emissary regarded it with the cluster of sensory organs it had settled on for this conversation. They'd stabilized around a form suggesting something between a deep-sea jellyfish and a thundercloud, which he had decided to interpret as a good sign, meaning they were trying to look approachable. Explain. My mom, he said, don't reduce disorder everywhere. They reduce unpredictability in the systems I apply them to. The rest of the universe remains exactly as chaotic as it's always been. Your decline isn't because of me specifically. It's because of the rate at which human civilization is moving toward predictive stability across multiple independent fields simultaneously. Even if you remove me, you're facing 40 or 50 other researchers approaching similar thresholds. You've focused on the most visible node in the network. It's an understandable error when you're used to operating in chaos. But it's an error. The emissary held very still. He had not previously seen a Vreth hold very still. What's on the card, he continued. is a different model, one that shows you where the actual threshold points are, the places where human predictive development could be slowed not by removing researchers, but by introducing genuine systemic complexity into specific areas of infrastructure. Complexity that your kind generates naturally, as a byproduct of your presence. You don't need to destroy anything. You just need to exist in the right places. He paused. And in return, I want something. What? Your biology, he said. Specifically, your mutation mechanism. Not the biology itself. I understand that's not how it works. But the principle. The mathematical structure underneath the process. The way your cells make decisions about what to become without any central directive. The way a system can be in perpetual productive change without collapsing into noise. The emissary made a sound that the translation software classified as inquiry with confusion subtext. I've been trying to model the one variable I can't account for, he said. The irrational element. The thing that doesn't fit the matrix. I've been working with deterministic systems my whole career, and they're extraordinary. But they have a ceiling. Your biology doesn't have a ceiling. It mutates upward. I want to understand the mechanism. He did not say the rest of it. He did not say, and once I understand it, I intend to build it into my models. I intend to design predictive systems that incorporate productive disorder, that breathe the way you breathe. I intend to close the gap between order and chaos, not by eliminating one, but by learning to hold both. He did not say it because he didn't want them to understand what he was actually proposing until after they'd agreed. You describe, said the emissary, and then stopped. He waited. What you describe is not a compromise. No, he agreed. It is a trap. That depends on how you define the term. The emissary was still for a long time. The room temperature dropped 3 degrees, which his instruments recorded, and which he noted in his running log with professional detachment. He was terrified. He was doing a very good job of not showing it. He thought of something his mother had told him once. On the morning of an exam, he was convinced he'd failed. You've already done the work. The only thing left is to let it be done. Oh, I will convey this to the High Caster, the emissary said at last. Shh. It left through the electrical system, which now struck him as elegant rather than ominous. He got the answer 4 days later. Not through the building systems, through his own phone, which he had not given any breath, and which rang at 6 in the morning with a number he did not recognize. Who? He answered it. We accept your counteroffer, said the voice, which was not a voice, exactly, more like the sound a voice would make if you took the concept of a voice and stretched it across 3 octaves simultaneously. Conditions. Go ahead. The biological information you seek will be provided in stages. First stage only after you demonstrate that your complexity mapping is accurate, that the infrastructure nodes you have identified will absorb our presence without systemic collapse. How long do you need to verify the mapping? 43 of your days. Done. A pause. You are not afraid of us, the voice said. It is not a question. He thought about the honest answer, which was that he had been terrified for months, and was still terrified, and had spent 2 weeks running calculations that could be wrong, that had margins of error too large to be comfortable, that rested on a model of breath cognition assembled from 11 days of observation, and one face-to-face meeting with a creature that reorganized itself while they talked. He had run those calculations anyway, and placed that data card on that table anyway, and made that counteroffer anyway. I'm afraid of being wrong, he said. That's not the same thing. The line went quiet. Then, in a register below speech, something that might have been a sound of assessment, or respect, or both. The High Caster finds this answer interesting, the voice said. Thought he heard, at the very edge of the register, something that might have been laughter, or its equivalent. The sound a civilization makes when it encounters something it has not previously computed. 43 days passed. The complexity nodes held 3 municipal infrastructure systems, 1 orbital relay station, and a data processing center in the northern coastal region absorbed breath-generated disorder with the predicted resilience. Not without incident, but without collapse. The incidents were recorded, logged, analyzed. He updated his models with the new data. The models improved. The High Caster sent the first biological package on the 44th day. It was not a genome. It was not a chemical structure. It was as near as anyone could translate it, a set of governing principles, the logic beneath the mutation, the rules that the Vreth cells followed in their endless self-transformation. The rules were not simple. They were dense with implications, recursive and strange, built on mathematical structures that had no human analogs. He spent 6 weeks reading them before he showed them to anyone. When he finally brought Hara into the lab and walked her through what he'd been reading, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face very still, which meant she was having an emotion she hadn't decided what to do with yet. "If this is real," she said, "it's real. If this works the way you think it works, it does. I've run it 112 times." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the city moved with its usual organized hum. The hum that his work had spent 6 years making more predictable, more legible, more controlled. Looked at it and thought about what it would sound like when it learned to breathe differently. When the models could hold not just certainty, but genuine productive surprise. When you could predict the outline of things, while leaving room for the details to be wild. "What are you going to call it?" she asked. He'd been thinking about this for weeks. He'd tried formal names: dynamic variance architecture, stochastic integration framework, a dozen other phrases that described the mechanism without naming the feeling of it. The way it worked in his bones when he understood something new. The rush that came not from certainty, but from the moment before certainty, when everything was still possible. "I don't know yet," he said, which was for him the equivalent of saying, "This is the most interesting problem I have ever encountered." The Vreth did not leave. This had been anticipated. The complexity mapping was accurate. The specific infrastructure nodes could sustain their presence. And the Vreth, drawn to disorder like a tide to the moon, settled into those with something that read after a while, less like occupation and more like residence. They were not comfortable exactly, but they were not declining anymore. The Highcaster initiated 3 more communication exchanges over the following year, each through Kale's phone at 6 in the morning, each with the same quality of deliberateness that suggested a civilization that had decided, against its own instincts, to learn patience. The exchanges were short and technical. They concerned the complexity mapping. They concerned updates to the biological packages. Once briefly, the Highcaster mentioned that the congregate had noted with interest that the predictive architecture now being developed at the Meridian Complex appeared to operate on different principles than the architecture that had preceded it. "How do you find the new approach?" the Highcaster asked. He was at his desk. It was a clear morning. On the screen in front of him was a projection model unlike anything he had built before. Asymmetric, breathing, alive with productive noise in ways his old systems never had been. Was harder to run. It required more patience. Produced results that were, in a narrow technical sense, slightly less precise than his older models. In every other sense, it was better. "Strange," he said, "but good." A pause. "The congregate also finds this a useful description," said the Highcaster. He had the sense, as he sometimes did at the end of these calls, that he was speaking with something vast and old that was trying very hard to understand a new kind of question. The kind of question that didn't have a stable answer, that kept changing as the circumstances changed, that required a different kind of mind than the one you started with. He knew the feeling. The second biological package arrived 2 years after the first. By then, the work had moved beyond the Meridian Complex, had moved, in fact, beyond Kale's direct involvement, though he still ran the primary lab, and still came in at 6 and still stood at the edge of the observation platform in the mornings, looking at the readouts, looking for the thing that was wrong. 14 other research teams now worked on applications of the new architecture. 3 universities had begun graduate programs. A quiet revolution was spreading through every field that dealt with the future, which was every field. He watched it from his platform and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Genuine uncertainty about where it was going. This was not a problem. He had learned, was learning, to read uncertainty differently, not as a failure of the model correctly, breathing in the way that living things breathe, in the way that the Vreth breathed, in the way that the universe itself seemed to breathe when you stood still long enough to feel it. I found him there one evening. Long after the lab had emptied, standing in the amber light of the cooling system's status indicators, looking at nothing in particular. The high caster called again, she said. I know, I'll call back. It said something I couldn't parse. The translation software flagged it as uncertain. She handed him a transcript. Third line. He read it. The translation software had rendered it as, we have begun to find your future interesting rather than threatening. This is not a state we have previously occupied. He read it twice. What does it mean? Hara asked. He thought about the stone in still water, about the ripples, about the way everything around a new thing before it settles into a new pattern. It means they're curious, he said. About what? About what comes next. He handed the transcript back. Which makes two of us. He realized, smiling. The expression surprised him. He checked it against the projections. There were no projections for this, no model that had anticipated the moment, and decided, after a pause, that this was all right. Some things, it turned out, were better without the forecast. The city hummed below the platform, a little different than it had been, a little less smooth, a little more alive. In the sky, invisible to the naked eye, but present on every instrument he'd built, the Vreth moved through their chosen nodes, like weather, like breathing, like the universe practicing the art of not quite knowing what it was going to do next. He watched them for a while. Then he went back inside to work.